There is a peculiar hush that descends upon Radcliffe Square at dusk, a silence not born of absence but of expectation, as if the stones themselves are holding their breath. I remember walking across the uneven flagstones, my coat collar turned against a chill wind that carried with it the faint, metallic tang of impending rain. The Bodleian loomed ahead, a darkened sentinel whose windows, like unblinking eyes, reflected the last trembling light of the day. I paused for a moment near the fountain, listening to its quiet murmur, and wondered why the air felt heavier than usual, as though something had been left unsaid. I had come to the square intending only to escape the clutter of my own thoughts, to watch the shadows lengthen and the spires blur into one another, yet an unease had taken root in me. It was the sort of unease that does not announce itself with drama, but seeps gradually, like ink through paper. I had barely started toward the alley that led to the high street when I noticed a small, folded piece of paper lying by the edge of the fountain. It seemed to belong neither to the wind nor to the fountain, and yet it was there, innocuous, almost expectant. I picked it up, careful not to smudge the neat, precise handwriting. The words were few. "Meet me at St. Aldate's, 7 o'clock. No signature, no hint of who might have left it. Only the stark, almost impatient instruction. Curiosity, or perhaps habit, pulled me along the wet stones. My mind, trained to consider minutiae, lingered on the crease of the paper, the pressure of the ink, and the angle of the script. It was deliberate, not hurried, which told me something about the writer, someone used to order, accustomed to thought. As I walked, I could not help noticing how the dusk seemed to settle differently on each building. The shadows lengthened unevenly, conspiring with the lamplighters who moved like ghosts, their lanterns swaying gently. It was a familiar Oxford scene, yet tonight it held a charge, a subtle and pressing urgency. By the time I reached St. Aldate's, the church's spire cut a sharp line against a sky fading to indigo. I lingered in the doorway, observing the figures passing, their umbrellas and coats pressed against the rain that had begun to fall in fine, almost apologetic drops. The street was unusually empty, save for a solitary figure that caught my attention. A woman, tall, cloaked, standing beneath a lantern's sickly glow, her posture rigid, almost statuesque. She did not move as I approached, and yet the moment she glanced toward me, I sensed the faintest tremor of recognition. That tremor, I noted silently, was significant. As I came closer, I discerned the subtle irregularity of her gait, the careful avoidance of puddles as if each step were considered. My eyes caught a flash of something white tucked under her arm, a folded envelope perhaps, or some other small, important object. And though I did not speak, and she said nothing, the exchange of awareness was sufficient. We were actors in a scene already unfolding, neither fully scripted nor yet understood. I lingered there, the rain now wetting my coat and darkening my mood, and I could not shake the feeling that the night had begun without ceremony, slipping in quietly with secrets pressing against its chest. Something had shifted in Radcliffe Square, some imperceptible imbalance that invited scrutiny. And though the world continued around us, indifferent, I felt, as I always do at such moments, that the tiniest detail, an overlooked word, a gesture, a shadow might hold the first key to a story not yet willing to reveal itself. I first heard of Dr. Lionel Fairchild's death in the form of a terse telephone call, the sort that carries with it a careful balance of restraint and urgency. The voice on the line was unfamiliar, clipped but courteous, and I remember noting, as I hung up, the faint, metallic echo that suggested it had been spoken into a polished, quiet room rather than across the bustling lines of a station. The message was simple. Fairchild had been found in his rooms at Pembroke College, and the circumstances were unusual enough to merit my attention. There was no sense of panic, only an insistent expectation that someone would make sense of what had been left behind. The college itself was draped in evening fog, the lamps casting pools of amber that flickered across wet cobblestones. The smell of damp paper and polished wood greeted me as I entered the quadrangle, accompanied by that low, haunting echo of footsteps on stone. I could sense the tension before I saw it, the subtle stiffness in the porter's posture, the way the fellows moved with careful deliberation, as though each corridor and library held its breath in mourning. I was led to Fairchild's rooms, a modest suite lined with bookshelves, each shelf a deliberate chaos of texts ranging from Latin epics to contemporary philosophy. The scholar's life, I noted, had been meticulously cluttered. The body lay on the oriental rug, partially obscured by the shadows cast from a single desk lamp, the light slanting across the features of a man who had once seemed invincible in intellect, now rendered fragile, even spectral. There was no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no scattered papers. The corpse, I observed, was positioned in a manner almost ceremonial, the hands folded over the chest with deliberate care. I noted the faintest stain near the edge of his sleeve, almost imperceptible, but enough to suggest that the hand might have brushed something wet, though what, I could not yet say. It was a detail that would linger in my mind, insistent, waiting for its proper context. A small piece of paper had been placed atop the desk, just at the edge of the lamp's illumination, its corners curling slightly. The handwriting was precise, and in it a line from a poem, even in quiet, the heart may speak. I found myself thinking not only of the content, but of the deliberate placement, the intention behind leaving it there. Fairchild had been a man who revered order, and yet in these last moments, someone perhaps himself contrived a small poetic disturbance. As I examined the room, my attention drifted to the window. It was slightly ajar, letting in the damp evening air, and though it seemed trivial, the latch bore the faintest trace of a fingerprint. Not the scholars, I judged, nor any of the porters or fellows who had arrived before me. The detail was small, easy to overlook, but I felt its significance, as one might sense the first thread of a tapestry forming under careful hands. I spoke with a junior fellow who had discovered the body, noting his hesitations, the subtle avoidance of my gaze when I asked about the previous evening. He recalled a knock at the door, a visitor whose presence had seemed fleeting, yet he could not recall the face. I observed the tilt of his head, the slight tension in his shoulders, and I wondered whether memory or fear was guiding his account. It was a small hesitation, but in such matters, hesitation often sings with truth louder than certainty. By the time I left Pembroke, the fog had thickened, wrapping the college in a cloak of muted grey. I walked slowly through the quadrangle, listening to the drip of rain from the gargoyles, feeling the quiet insistence that knowledge, no matter how vast, is often accompanied by ignorance of the most intimate kind. Fairchild's death was a question mark carved in stone and shadow, a reminder that the human mind, even at its most disciplined, can be undone by what it does not anticipate. And in that quiet, I knew that the faintest gestures, the curl of paper, the smudge of ink, the tilt of a head would guide me, if only I was willing to watch. The following morning, I returned to Fairchild's rooms, the air heavy with damp and the faint tang of ink, as if the books themselves exhaled in mourning. The janitor had been in front of me, tidying with an anxious efficiency, and yet, despite the order, there was an unease in the corners of the room, small shadows that clung to the shelves, gaps between the books where a manuscript might have once rested. I remembered the folded envelope from the previous evening, still on the desk, now slightly more creased, as though someone had handled it carefully, and then left it again, as though waiting for me to notice. I unfolded the envelope. Inside lay a manuscript, its pages bound together with a ribbon frayed at the edges, the handwriting unmistakably Fairchild's, tight, deliberate, with flourishes at the margins, almost ornamental. I paused, running a finger along the first line, noting the subtle pressure, the rhythm of thought pressed into ink. It spoke of a theory, one that had obsessed him for months, a connection between classical philosophy and contemporary ethics. But as I read, I sensed a peculiar hesitation in the prose, a shadow of doubt that seemed out of place in a man so meticulous. It was that hesitation, I realized, that might hold the first clue to understanding the events of his last night. I examined the room more closely. The manuscript had not been disturbed, yet the desk bore other signs. A faint smudge on the corner, the imprint of a hand that had lingered, deliberate or accidental, over a page. I traced it lightly, curious whether it was Fairchild's or someone else's. It occurred to me that a hand so careful as to leave such a trace might have been guided by intention, by a desire to communicate something unspoken. Small gestures, easily overlooked, often carry the weight of meaning. The window remained slightly ajar, the rain seeping in and darkening the sill, yet the latch had been turned in a way that suggested it had not been left carelessly. Someone had entered or left with awareness of the details that mattered to a scholar. I also noticed the faint scent of tobacco, not Fairchild's, and a single, overlooked footprint near the bookcase, pressed lightly into the rug. It was subtle, almost polite, but distinct, and I filed it away in my mind, the way one might tuck a half-remembered melody behind the air. Later, I spoke with a fellow who had been closest to Fairchild in his studies, a young man of keen mind and hesitant speech. He recalled seeing the scholar late the previous evening in the library, apparently engrossed in research. Yet he admitted to noticing a strange air about him, a nervous impatience, a glance over the shoulder that seemed unnecessary, but was there nonetheless. I observed the fellow's careful phrasing, the almost imperceptible tightening of his lips, and made a quiet note to myself. Memory is often selective, and what is omitted sometimes tells more than what is recounted. As I returned to the manuscript, I found a marginal note I had overlooked initially, a single word underlined thrice revelation. It struck me as both promise and warning, a reminder that knowledge, once unearthed, is never neutral. I placed the pages carefully back into their envelope, the ribbon brushing against my fingers with a faint, deliberate friction. Outside, Oxford was cloaked in mist, the streets silent, but for the distant toll of a bell, its sound pressing lightly against the spine of the city, a reminder that the rhythm of life continues even when tragedy intervenes. The manuscript, like Fairchild himself, had emerged quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet it carried the faint weight of intent, a whisper in ink. I sensed that it was only the beginning, that within its careful lines and pauses lay a path I would need to follow, step by cautious step, as the shadows lengthened and the secrets of the evening prepared themselves for revelation. The streets of Oxford were mercifully quiet that evening, the drizzle smoothing the cobblestones and turning them into a mirror for the dim lamplight. I walked slowly toward the old college archives, my coat dampened at the collar, my thoughts elsewhere. Fairchild's manuscript had left me restless, not for what it contained alone, but for what it suggested, connections, old grudges, and the unspoken histories that Oxford prefers to keep folded neatly, like letters in a drawer. There is a peculiar weight to history in this city. It lingers in the corners, in the stone, in the scent of leather-bound volumes that have not been touched for decades, and sometimes that weight presses with the subtle insistence of a warning. The archivist, a slender man with eyes that missed nothing yet said very little, greeted me with a nod that seemed both courteous and weary. He led me through corridors lined with tomes so ancient that their spines bore the faintness of whispered prayers. I noticed the way his hand lingered over one particular shelf, not with hesitation, but with recognition, a small gesture that suggested knowledge unspoken. That gesture, I thought, might be more telling than the explanations I would elicit with polite questions. I began my search among the registers of past fellows, tracing names and dates, each entry a fragment of life, meticulously recorded yet curiously incomplete. And then I found him, or rather, the echo of Fairchild's predecessor, Dr. Henry Mallory, whose untimely departure from the college had always been spoken of in hushed tones. There were gaps in the ledger, anomalies that suggested a resignation, hurried or coerced, the reasons obscured by time and discretion. A folded scrap of parchment had been pressed between the pages, as if someone, Mallory or another, had wanted to leave a trace for a careful reader. The note contained a single word, written in a hand that bore familiarity with both precision and tremor caution, a word that resonated across decades, like a bell whose toll had never been heard until this moment. I recalled a conversation with a junior fellow the previous evening, the subtle tremor in his voice when he mentioned Mallory's name, the way he had glanced over his shoulder as if the past were not entirely behind him. There is, in Oxford, a quiet fear of what lingers, the knowledge that actions taken years ago may bear consequences long after the actors have departed. I wondered, as I leafed through the faded documents, if Fairchild had stumbled upon something similar, a shadow cast long and cold, and if that shadow had been waiting, patiently, to exact its influence. The room smelled of dust and damp vellum, a fragrance that somehow makes memory more acute. I noticed the archivist's shoes, polished yet scuffed at the heel, and the way he avoided a particular floorboard near the entrance, where a small, irregular depression suggested long-forgotten foot traffic. I could not tell if the avoidance was habitual or conscious, yet it seemed to echo the caution inscribed in that ancient note. There is a subtle communication in behavior, gestures too slight to register unless one is willing to wait, to watch, to consider them with patience. Hours passed. Outside, the rain became more insistent, a steady drum on leaded windows, and I felt the weight of observation pressing down. Shadows moved in the periphery, the archives themselves seeming to lean closer, to whisper of the histories they contain, histories that are never fully silent, never entirely inert. I traced the lines of ink, the creases in the parchment, and the faint indentation of words long since erased, thinking that the past, in its meticulous concealment, often leaves the most revealing traces in what it does not say. I left the archives as night fell fully, the gas lamps flickering along the streets, casting shadows that lengthened like fingers, reaching for some unremembered secret. The past, I knew, was not gone, merely deferred. It waits in corners, in the weight of manuscripts, in gestures unnoticed, in a cautionary word pressed between pages. And I, walking beneath the spires now shrouded in mist, felt the quiet insistence that the shadows of Oxford, like those of its scholars, have a memory that refuses to be ignored. The room where I conducted the questioning was modest, its high windows draped with heavy curtains that muffled the late afternoon light, softening it into a kind of reluctant glow. I sat across from the young fellow who had been closest to Fairchild, a man whose intellect was evident in the careful selection of words, yet whose hesitation betrayed the anxiety of someone aware that every answer might reveal more than intended. The silence between us was not empty, but charged, as though the air itself waited for revelation, and I allowed it to linger, letting the unease settle like dust before I spoke. I began with the ordinary, asking about the scholar's habits, the rhythm of his days, the evenings spent among books and notes. The fellow recounted these details with precision, his voice quiet, measured, yet I noticed how his hands fidgeted with the cuff of his sleeve when I mentioned Pembroke's archives. A small gesture, almost imperceptible but significant, the attention of a careful mind, can sometimes be read in the spaces between words rather than the words themselves. I made a note of it, aware that a scholar's nervousness is often more revealing than a confession. He mentioned Fairchild's particular obsession in recent months, the manuscript that now lay on my desk, and his fascination with Mallory's departure years before. I let him speak without interruption, observing the occasional glance toward the door, the way he shifted in his chair when I raised questions about the previous evening. It was not deception alone that I was noting, but the subtle weight of memory, the way people preserve or distort it unconsciously. A fellow's instinct to protect, even from himself, often leaves traces in voice and posture. There was a pause, a moment in which he seemed to wrestle with whether to speak further. I did not rush him. Oxford teaches patience as much as it does scholarship. It rewards the quiet observer who notes the small details. He finally mentioned a visitor to Fairchild's rooms the night before, a figure who had left abruptly and whose presence seemed to unsettle the scholar more than it should have. He could not recall the visitor's features, only that the coat was dark, the gait measured, almost deliberate. The hesitation in recounting this, the careful choice of adjectives, suggested both fear and something else, perhaps an unacknowledged familiarity. I leaned back, considering the folds of the curtains, the shadows they cast, and the faint scuff on the floor where the fellow's shoe had caught the rug moments before. Small, easily overlooked, yet it aligned with the nervous rhythm of his account. There was a precision to his movements, a repetition that suggested rehearsal, though whether memory or self-protection remained unclear. I also noted the faint scent of pipe tobacco lingering on his sleeve, a detail that might have been accidental or deliberately retained. As the interview drew to a close, I asked him to recount once more the events of the evening leading to Fairchild's discovery. I watched the way his eyes darted to the windows, to the desk, to the stack of books by the door. He hesitated at one point over a particular volume, a classic text Fairchild had frequently referenced, and I felt a subtle tension in the air as if the page itself held a secret, or at least a suggestion, unspoken yet palpable. That pause, that flicker of recognition, became my quietest clue someone else had been there, had handled that book, and had known precisely what to leave behind and what to conceal. When the young fellow finally rose to leave, he seemed lighter, relieved perhaps to have spoken, and I remained behind, noting the faint indentation of his hand on the desk where he had rested it, the imperceptible curl of the paper beneath his fingers. It was a minor trace, almost nothing, yet it suggested intent, deliberation, and knowledge, a whisper in the margins that demanded attention. In Oxford, the quietest gestures often speak the loudest truths, and I knew that this one would linger in my mind, pressing forward through the shadows of the case like an unresolved chord in a familiar tune. The evening air carried a faint chill as I made my way to the college dining hall, a place that seemed to hold its breath beneath the weight of history, where oak beams creaked in acknowledgement of the countless conversations that had passed beneath them. The hall was nearly empty, the long tables polished to a dull gleam, and the scent of wine and old wax mingling with the faint, lingering aroma of candle smoke. I had been summoned under the guise of a collegial gathering, though I suspected the real purpose was quieter, more delicate conversation meant to unravel what could not be forced into speech. I was shown to a small corner where a group of fellows had assembled, their expressions guarded and their gestures measured. They spoke of trivial matters first, the weather, the peculiar softness of the evening fog, and the cricket match postponed by rain. Yet even in the lightness of conversation, there were pauses, the weight of what was unspoken pressing against the rhythm of words. I sipped the wine they offered, noting its sharpness, the faint trace of oak, and allowed my mind to wander through the architecture of the room, the way shadows gathered beneath the beams, the subtle creak of a floorboard betraying the passage of a late arrival. One fellow spoke of Fairchild with deliberate care, recounting his habits and the meticulous order he imposed on his work. I noticed, as he spoke, a subtle flicker in the eyes of another, a shadow crossing where none should have been. That shadow, I recognized instantly, was not mere distraction, but a hesitation the mind momentarily betrayed by an awareness it sought to conceal. I made a quiet note that the smallest interruption of cadence often carries the heaviest significance. The conversation drifted toward the manuscript, and here the subtleties became more pronounced. One fellow, younger than the rest, offered an anecdote about a marginal note Fairchild had made in a book on Mallory, a comment almost parenthetical, yet marked with insistence. The way he described it, his hand trembled lightly as though the memory itself bore consequence. I considered that tremor, not the words, as the critical detail. The manuscript was more than text. It was a map of tensions, old rivalries, and careful observation. As the wine flowed, I observed more than I questioned, allowing the fellow's chatter to reveal patterns unintended. A cup placed slightly askew, a hand lingering a moment too long over a page, a glance cast toward the entrance, all became small signals, like constellations hinting at a hidden design. One detail, almost laughable in its simplicity, struck me. The younger fellow had unconsciously refilled his glass twice without tasting it, an anxious repetition signaling concern or fear, or perhaps a habitual attempt to maintain composure under the scrutiny of peers. There was mention of an evening stroll, a path along the old stone wall where Fairchild had often been seen pacing, lost in thought. One elder fellow recalled passing by, hearing fragments of speech, almost inaudible, yet distinct in their cadenced words that hinted at regret, perhaps, or warning. I leaned back in my chair, tasting the wine slowly, and thought of the manuscript, the margins, the subtle emphasis of a word underlined, the tremor of memory, and realized that these shadows of speech, these half-heard phrases, were as meaningful as the written text itself. By the time the gathering ended, the hall had fallen into near silence, the fellows dispersing like mist retreating from lantern light. I remained, my glass untouched, noting the faint residue of footprints near the threshold, the scuff of a shoe against the polished floor, and the softest whisper of candle smoke drifting toward the rafters. In Oxford, secrets are rarely shouted. They move quietly, in gestures, in pauses, in the smallest movements of hand and eye. And I, listening to those whispers in the dim, sensed that Fairchild's story was not yet concluded, that each subtle gesture, each unnoticed tremor, would draw me further into the shadows, toward truths that could only be discerned through patience, observation, and a careful taste for the quiet music of suspicion. I spent the morning in the quiet of my flat, the rain tapping insistently against the window, the scent of damp stone drifting in through the slightly ajar casement. Fairchild's manuscript lay spread across the desk, its pages a jumble of ink and careful annotations, and beside it, the crossword puzzle I had begun the previous evening. There is a peculiar solace in crosswords, a rhythm to the mental labor that resembles the process of deducting the gradual fitting together of fragments until meaning emerges. I had long suspected that Fairchild, in his last days, might have employed a similar method, using coded references and marginal notes to direct attention, to hide or reveal according to a logic only he fully understood. I traced a line of writing that had initially appeared unremarkable, a simple observation about the relationship between Mallory and his successor, when a small irregularity caught my eye. The letter had been slightly overwritten, the ink darker, suggesting a second stroke, almost imperceptible to casual inspection. It was a minor detail, yet in a scholar's hand, the correction was rarely accidental. I set it aside, letting it mingle with the patterns forming in my mind, as one sets a bookmark for a page one knows will be revisited with care. Turning to the crossword, I noticed that a series of clues seemed to echo phrases in the manuscript. A word describing concealment here, a reference to vigilance there. I began to wonder if Fairchild had embedded something in plain sight, a cipher using the familiar form of leisure to disguise intent. As I filled in the squares, I felt the slow thrill of recognition letters intersecting, aligning in a way that suggested both instruction and warning, the playful brilliance of a mind insisting on communication even in absence. A knock at the door interrupted my reverie. It was the junior fellow, hesitantly entering, his hands empty, his posture careful. He had come, he said, with observations he had only just recalled, small inconsistencies in his own account that troubled him. I gestured for him to sit, observing the way he adjusted the folds of his coat, the subtle way his eyes lingered on the manuscript and the crossword. There was a hesitation, an almost imperceptible curl of the lip that suggested thought attempting to catch up with memory. That small detail, as with the overwritten letter, seemed to carry weight disproportionate to its size. He spoke of a conversation overheard in the library, a fragment of dialogue that had seemed unimportant at the time, involving words like sequence and pattern, repeated in a tone of quiet insistence. I listened, not interrupting, noting the rhythm of speech, the way emphasis fell upon certain consonants, the faint inflection that suggested more than the literal meaning. As he spoke, I aligned it with the puzzle before me, the manuscript annotations, and the overwritten ink. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a shape began to emerge, a lattice of implication woven between the playful surface of a puzzle and the scholarly seriousness of Fairchild's work. By the time he left, I was alone again, the rain steady and soft, the flat dimly lit by the afternoon gloom. I returned to the puzzle, running my pen along intersecting words, noting coincidences and anomalies, and I felt that familiar thrill of connection, the sense that hidden order might be revealed not by brute inspection, but by attentive observation. Somewhere in the pattern, in the cross of letters and the strokes of ink, lay a message, a hint, a whisper from the past insisting upon recognition. And I, sitting in silence, listening to the rain and the faint creak of floorboards, knew that the next step would demand patience, care, and the quiet willingness to notice the smallest deviation, the minor distortion that holds the key to understanding. I arrived at Pembroke College just as the afternoon sun began to wane. The quadrangle bathed in a muted gold that softened the sharp edges of stone and shadow. There is a peculiar silence in Oxford at that hour, a momentary reprieve between the bustle of daytime lectures and the ritualized order of evening study. I moved toward the east wing, where Fairchild's rooms had been, noting the slight irregularity of a window left ajar, a detail that had struck me before, yet seemed newly significant in the light of recent discoveries. The junior fellow had agreed, albeit reluctantly, to show me a passage seldom used, a corridor that led to rooms hidden behind unremarkable doors, spaces that existed in the margins of college life. The door itself was plain, unmarked, its frame blending with the surrounding stone, yet the keyhole bore the faintest scratch, as though someone had tested it repeatedly, seeking entry or exit. I observed the fellow's hesitation, the careful way he avoided touching the handle with his knuckles exposed, and I understood at once that he knew more than he admitted, that his reluctance was itself a gesture of warning. Inside, the air was cool and still, a contrast to the warmth outside, and the scent of dust and old wood filled my senses. The room had been maintained with deliberate care, yet it held evidence of recent occupation. A chair slightly pulled from the desk, a folded manuscript on the window-sill, and the faint impression of footprints in the rug, partially obscured by dust. I noted each element in turn, allowing my attention to linger on the details. Most would overlook the alignment of books on a shelf, the subtle variation in the ink on a page, the gentle curl of a curtain that had been disturbed but not fully drawn back. It was here, in this room, that I first noticed the small, overlooked anomalies in Fairchild's papers. Marginalia that seemed merely decorative at first revealed themselves to be directional, guiding the careful observer from one point to another, like a map embedded within text. A single phrase, underlined twice, suggested urgency, while another, almost imperceptibly crossed out, hinted at concealment. The juxtaposition of these marks spoke of intention, of a mind both brilliant and cautious, and I felt the familiar thrill of deduction. The first hints of motive often appear in minutiae. The junior fellow moved hesitantly, lingering by a tall cabinet whose doors bore no handles, opening to reveal a small storage space, once unnoticed, now a repository of documents and personal effects. Among these were letters, meticulously folded, and a ledger detailing interactions with other fellows, names and dates recorded with quiet precision. One entry, marked with a symbol I recognized from the manuscript, suggested a prior meeting of significance, yet the purpose remained opaque. I made a note that the hidden is rarely meaningless. It is deliberate, chosen, and often laden with consequence. We left the room in silence, each step along the corridor echoing faintly, the shadows lengthening as dusk approached. I considered the implications of the hidden spaces, the careful concealment, and the gestures both of objects and of persons that hinted at motive and opportunity. Oxford teaches that knowledge is layered, that the walls themselves may hold secrets, and that what is overlooked often proves most revealing. By the time I returned to the quadrangle, night had fallen, and the lamps cast pools of amber along the stone. I lingered at the edge of the square, noting the rhythm of my own footsteps and the faint creak of a distant gate, contemplating the intricate interplay of concealment and revelation. Fairchild's death, once a singular event, now appeared intertwined with histories, intentions, and spaces hidden in plain sight. The smallest anomaly, the barely perceptible hesitation, might yet prove decisive. In the quiet of Oxford evening, I understood that the pursuit of truth requires patience, a careful eye, and the willingness to follow the shadows wherever they lead. I remember the morning beginning with a low, persistent drizzle, the kind that stains stone and softens the edges of Oxford, lending the streets an air of hesitation, as though the city itself were reluctant to reveal its truths. I had returned to Fairchild's rooms, drawn by the persistent sense that a single, overlooked element might illuminate the broader pattern of his death. Scholars and detectives share a peculiar affinity for minutiae, a gesture, a smudge, a word placed just so. It is the minor detail, often disregarded, that can pivot the understanding of a case. The room bore the familiar traces of recent attention books aligned with meticulous care, the manuscript on the desk still tied with its frayed ribbon, the faint impression of a hand in the dust where a chair had been shifted. I traced the edge of the envelope, noting the crease that suggested multiple openings, perhaps hesitation, perhaps a private consultation of some instruction. I've long observed that the frequency of contact with an object, even one as trivial as paper, often reflects the intensity of concern, and I filed the thought quietly in my mind. A small cabinet in the corner, unremarkable to any visitor, drew my attention. Its door bore a barely perceptible scratch, as if repeatedly opened with a key just slightly ill-fitting. Inside were letters, some unsigned, others carrying the faintest trace of a seal. One envelope had been opened, the contents removed, yet the faint impression of the text remained, like a shadow of intent pressed into the paper. The handwriting was unmistakably deliberate, a scholar's hand, precise yet slightly tremulous. I considered the tremor in context, age, excitement, or perhaps concealment. Each possibility carried equal weight until further observation could decide. I sat at the desk, pen poised over a notebook, and recalled a conversation with the junior fellow. His recollection of the prior evening had been careful, precise, yet there had been one gesture I had not fully appreciated at the time, the manner in which he had brushed his fingers across the surface of the manuscript without seeming to touch it. It was subtle, almost unconscious, yet it indicated recognition, perhaps guilt, perhaps reverence, and certainly a relationship to the events beyond mere observation. Minor, yes, but not inconsequential. As I leafed through Fairchild's notes, my eye caught an anomaly, a marginal annotation that repeated a phrase in two different sections, slightly varied in wording. The variation was almost imperceptible, But in the context of a scholar obsessed with precision, the discrepancies seemed deliberate, signaling a clue or a warning. I made a small mark in my notebook, noting the repetition and variation. The pattern, I suspected, was intentional, an instruction for the careful reader who was willing to notice. A faint scuff on the floorboard near the desk drew my attention next, easily overlooked beneath the dust of years and the neat arrangement of rugs. It suggested movement of a particular weight, uneven in stride, distinct from either the scholar's or the junior fellow's gait. The irregularity was minor, subtle, yet its significance became clear when considered alongside the repeated annotations and the trembling of the envelope's edges. Someone had handled the papers with purpose, someone whose presence had left no other obvious trace. By the time I left the room, the drizzle had thickened, the city now blurred in grey and gold. I walked the quadrangle slowly, considering the cumulative weight of what I had noted. Creases, tremors, scuffs, subtle repetition, gestures almost imperceptible. Each minor detail, when assembled with patience, formed a lattice through which the broader truth might be glimpsed. Fairchild's death was not a single act, but a convergence of intention, oversight, and the quiet influence of those around him. And I, moving beneath the soft lamplight and the faint echo of footsteps, knew that these smallest of elements would prove decisive, though their full meaning remained as elusive as the evening mist curling around the spires of Oxford. The evening had settled into a quiet melancholy, the fog curling around the college spires like a reluctant curtain, softening edges and muffling sound. I arrived at the rooms of the fellow I had long suspected, the one whose gestures and hesitations had left faint, insistent marks on my memory. He greeted me without surprise, as though he had anticipated my presence, and there was a certain precision to his movements that betrayed both discipline and tension. I noted the subtle crease in his brow, the way his fingers lingered over a book spine before settling on the edge of the desk. Minor details, yet in Oxford they often spoke louder than words. I took a chair opposite him, observing how he avoided the lamp's direct glow, allowing his face to remain partially in shadow. The conversation began with the usual preliminaries, weather, lectures, and the quiet disturbances of the college, but I let it linger in the ordinary, sensing that the extraordinary would reveal itself in its own time. As we spoke, I noted the tremor in his voice when Fairchild's name arose, a minor inflection, almost imperceptible, yet entirely revealing. It was the same hesitation I had observed weeks before, now crystallized into clarity. He finally spoke of the evening in question, recounting movements, knocks at doors, the seemingly trivial arrangement of papers, and the half-forgotten annotations in Fairchild's manuscript. Each detail was delivered with careful control, yet the very care suggested concealment, a deliberate shaping of memory to suit intention. I allowed him to speak uninterrupted, noting the repetition of certain phrases, the curling of a hand over the edge of a notebook, and the occasional glance toward the window, where night pressed against the glass in quiet insistence. There was a rhythm to these actions, a silent punctuation that drew the outline of motive in the spaces between words. He confessed eventually, though the admission was neither theatrical nor unrestrained. It arrived as a whisper of inevitability, a recognition of the past converging with circumstance. The words themselves were simple, almost understated, yet the act of confessing bore the weight of deliberate choice. I watched his eyes, noting the fleeting shift in expression, the momentary release of tension, and the slight curling of lips that betrayed both relief and regret. These micro-gestures were, as always, more telling than any declaration. I drew attention, gently, to the small details I'd observed, the smudge on the manuscript, the barely noticeable footprints in Fairchild's room, the overwritten letters in the margins. Each was minor, almost insignificant in isolation, yet their cumulative effect formed a lattice of intention, guiding the narrative from ambiguity toward clarity. The fellow's gaze flickered at each mention, the slight hesitation betraying recognition, a tacit acknowledgement of the truth behind each observation. The confessions were interwoven with reflections on the scholar himself, on his meticulousness, his obsession with order, and the delicate care he took in embedding messages within his work. There was admiration, too, even amid the admission, a recognition that the victim's intellect had set the terms of the engagement. It was the quietest sort of respect, conveyed not in words but in posture, in the small, reverent gestures toward the manuscripts that had inspired both crime and revelation. When I left, the fog had thickened, and the lamps cast a trembling amber across wet stones. The confession hung between us, neither fully resolved nor entirely complete, as if the act itself had merely opened the door to understanding without illuminating it fully. Oxford, I thought, is patient. It allows shadows to stretch, minor details to accumulate, and the careful observer to discern what others overlook. That night I walked slowly through the quadrangle, listening to the subtle creak of floorboards, the distant toll of a bell, aware that in the quietest gestures and the smallest admissions, the truth had begun to take its place, measured, deliberate, and inexorably unfolding. The flat was quiet when I returned, the rain softened to a fine mist that pressed against the windows, blurring the outlines of the spires beyond. Fairchild's manuscript lay on the desk, its ribbon untied now, pages spread as if waiting for careful inspection. I sat, the weight of the case pressing gently upon me, and allowed myself the luxury of observation, letting the room and its faint odors, the subtle tang of ink, the whisper of aged paper guide my attention. In Oxford, details tend to accumulate quietly, almost invisibly, until they form their own pattern, one that is revealed only to the patient eye. I began with the marginalia, small notations that I had previously dismissed as scholarly flourish. A phrase repeated, an underlined word, a symbol in the corner of a page, each insignificant alone, yet together they hinted at a concealed message. I traced the letters with my finger, noting the uneven pressure, the slight tremor in the ink, and I realized that Fairchild had embedded a cipher, subtle, deliberate, intended only for a reader both attentive and informed. It was the kind of quiet ingenuity I'd come to expect from him, a reflection of the mind that had both created and suffered under the manuscript's weight. A note tucked between 2 pages caught my attention, the handwriting slightly different, more hurried, yet unmistakably connected to Fairchild. The words were few. The key lies where shadow meets light. I considered this for some time, recalling the way the afternoon sun had fallen across his desk in the days before his death, the pattern of illumination shifting as the hours passed. Small gestures, often overlooked, can conceal remarkable intent, and I suspected that the manuscript's secret required both patience and a careful eye to uncover. I examined the fold of a particular page, noting the impressions left by the pen and indentation, subtle, almost imperceptible, suggesting the use of a separate sheet beneath. I lifted it cautiously and discovered faint pencil marks, a series of letters and numbers that had faded with time, yet retained enough clarity to suggest a code, perhaps a sequence of references within the manuscript itself. I felt that familiar thrill of discovery, the kind that accompanies the recognition of order where chaos once seemed dominant. The air shifted as I traced the code, the mist pressing against the windows, the room itself seeming to lean closer in quiet observation. I realized that each annotation, each underlined phrase, had been placed with deliberate attention to sequence, pattern, and the subtle interplay of light and shadow. A reference here, a repetition there, all forming a lattice that guided the careful reader toward a revelation hidden in plain sight. It was both playful and insistent, a testament to the scholar's mind, meticulous yet imaginative. I paused to consider the significance, aware that understanding the cipher might illuminate not only Fairchild's final work, but also the circumstances surrounding his death. The minor details, the tremor in ink, the fold of the page, the positioning of shadows were not merely academic exercises, but keys to comprehension. The manuscript had become a repository of intention, an artifact where thought and consequence converged silently, awaiting recognition. When I finally closed the pages, the room seemed to exhale, the mist outside pressing gently against the glass, the faint echo of raindrops providing a metronome for reflection. The secret of the manuscript remained partially concealed, yet I sensed that the faintest traces of the pattern of light, the repetition of letters, and the subtle punctuation would guide the next step. Oxford, I realized once more, is patient. It rewards the observer who watches, waits, and discerns in the quietest gestures the truths that others overlook. The manuscript's secret, like the city itself, demanded care, attention, and the willingness to follow the smallest thread wherever it might lead. The fog had settled low in Jericho Lane, the lamplight spilling amber pools onto slick cobblestones. I walked, slowly, coat collar turned against the chill, listening to the faint drip of water from eaves and gutters. The lane always struck me as a place where time accumulated quietly, where the ordinary hum of life is softened into the whispers of history. Even the shadows seemed deliberate here, pressing close to walls and corners as though protecting secrets that would only reveal themselves to those who lingered long enough to notice. I paused near a narrow doorway, its frame shadowed, the latch worn by countless hands. There was a faint scuff of boot leather along the threshold, subtle enough to be disregarded by most, yet insistent to an eye trained to observe the minor variations that speak volumes. I crouched, noting the angle of the mark. The faint pressure applied unevenly, and I recognized immediately that it was not accidental. Someone had lingered here, perhaps hesitated, leaving behind a trace intended or perhaps entirely unintentional telling. The quiet was interrupted only by the distant bell of a church, its sound rolling over rooftops and curling into the mist. I walked further, past the narrow shuttered windows of old houses, noting the arrangement of pots on ledges, the slight lean of a lamp-post, the smell of damp stone and coal smoke. Each detail was part of a larger pattern, and I felt, as I always do, that the rhythm of observation can reveal more than words or testimony. There is a subtle poetry in the cumulative effect of small, deliberate acts, gestures, and placements. I arrived at a particular corner where a side street opened briefly onto a courtyard, where the bricks were uneven and the shadows longer than they seemed to have a right to be. Here I noted the imprint of a hand against the wall, faint, almost ghostly, the residue of what might have been a pause, a search, or an act of concealment. It was an insignificant mark to anyone else, yet in its placement and orientation it whispered of intention, and I filed it quietly, aware that it might later illuminate a broader truth. A figure emerged from the mist, moving with careful deliberation, shoulders hunched against the chill. I recognized him from my inquiries. His gait measured, the slight swing of a coat, the subtle hesitation before stepping over a puddle. He approached as if expecting me, and there was an immediate, unspoken understanding that conversation would follow and that it would not be entirely comfortable. We walked together, our pace dictated by the rhythm of the lane, our words minimal, punctuated by observations of the ordinary. The faint creak of a gate, the rustle of paper against a doorstep, the glint of wet cobbles in the lamplight. He spoke cautiously of Fairchild, of shadows past and present, of letters handled too many times, of manuscripts whose secrets demand attention. I noted his gestures, a flick of the hand toward a doorstep, the tilt of his head when he mentioned a particular phrase from the manuscript, and the slight tightening of his fingers around his coat lapel. Each movement, minor in isolation, formed a lattice of information, revealing more than the speech alone could convey. As we parted at the far end of the lane, I lingered a moment, listening to the soft patter of mist against stone, feeling the familiar weight of observation, pressing lightly, yet insistently. Jericho Lane had offered no grand revelation, no climactic disclosure, only the accumulation of minor details, the scuff, the handprint, the hesitation, the glance that together suggested direction, motive, and consequence. Oxford, in its quiet insistence, teaches patience, and here, in the dim light of dusk, I understood once more that the city's whispers are often found in the narrowest lanes, in the smallest gestures, and in the spaces between shadow and lamp where the truth waits to be discerned.